So hello everyone, I'm Rebecca Thomas, a senior analyst from the Observatory and Cancer Analyst team at Public Health Wales, and today me and my colleague Ffion Thomas will be presenting our findings on phase 1 of our project looking at inequalities in cancer incidence in Wales by sociodemographic characteristics. As the title suggests, the aim of our project was to identify inequalities in cancer incidence rates in Wales by sociodemographic factors at the individual level and provide a broad overview of the different makeup of cancer patients in Wales. It was decided for phase 1 of the project due to the availability and completeness of these variables, and a couple of being proximal measures of deprivation, that we would look at ethnicity, overcrowding based on the number of people per bedroom, occupation of socially active and retired persons, and household tenure. On to the methodology. So the first thing was the linkage. We linked anonymised WICASU population-based cancer registry data from 2011 to 2020 for all malignant cancers in Wales, excluding non-melanoma skin cancer, to individual ONS Census 11 data within the SAIL Databank. Unfortunately, Census 21 data wasn't available to us within SAIL at the time for phase 1 of this project. This flowchart then takes you through the linkage, starting with the 193,704 malignant cancer cases diagnosed between 2011 and 2020 in Wales. You can see that 165,588 cases, approximately 85%, linked to a 2011 census record. We found the linkage dropped off as the year of diagnosis moved further from the census year, as to be expected. Additional linkage then was carried out for ethnicity using the ethnicity spine, which is created and available in SAIL. Cases that either didn't link to a census record or cases that did link but no ethnicity information was available were linked to the ethnicity spine. And of the original 193,000 odd cases, 98% were linked to a valid ethnicity group. Onto the statistics. We calculated proportions for each group and by stage and by cancer type for the whole 10-year diagnosis period, and also crude rates and age standardized rates for the diagnosis year 2020 where possible, using the available ONS Census 21 data to calculate the underlying population. So throughout my many years working on cancer data, a common question that comes up time and time again is, do you have breakdowns by ethnicity? So this was of personal interest to me. So just looking a bit at the background of ethnicity before showing our findings, using the Census 21 data available on the ONS website, approximately 93% of the population in Wales identified or classified themselves in the white ethnic group at the time of the census. And you can see the next largest group is the Asian ethnic group of about 3%. Breaking each ethnicity group down further by age and sex to check for an underlying background differences between the ethnic groups, which may have an impact on cancer incidence. You can see here for the white ethnic group, with the bars representing the percentage of white ethnic group population in each age group, there's a high percentage in the older categories, as the white group makes up 93. Here are the charts for the other ethnic groups. They're coming through. So for the other ethnic groups, I'm not sure, I can't see the slide yet. So, oh, there we are.
Sorry, Becky.
Brilliant, thank you. And although they are quite small, the charts, you can see the difference in age structures, with all these ethnic groups having a much younger age structure than the white ethnic group, which, as we saw in the previous slide, broadly followed the All Wales line. And as it is well established that age is a risk factor for developing cancer, which would suggest that as a result of the older age structure for the white ethnic group, there are more people with a higher risk of developing cancer in this population than in the other ethnic groups. And this can be seen in this next chart, which shows crude rates for all malignancies in Wales for 2020 by ethnic group, which hasn't taken into consideration the age structure of the groups. The white ethnic group has statistically significantly higher rates of cancer than all the other ethnic groups. However, for the next slide, when we age standardize, although the white ethnic group is still statistically significantly different to all the other age groups other than the mixed ethnic group, the rates are much more in line. Further investigation to look at other factors and differences between the ethnic groups, such as deprivation, etc., is required. We then went on to look at the distribution of cancers for each ethnic group. Looking at distribution of cancers in the Asian ethnic group, female breast cancer is more common than other types of cancers analysed. Then looking at the distribution of cancers in the Black ethnic group, prostate cancer is more common than other types of cancer analysed, and this is supported by other research which found Black men at a higher risk of developing prostate cancer compared to men of other ethnicities. And then looking at the distribution of cancer in the mixed ethnic group, lung cancer is more common than other types of cancers analysed. This would partly be due to the difference in sex and age distribution for each ethnic group. And finally, we went on to look at stage distribution by ethnic group. The Asian ethnic group show more favorable staging with a high proportion diagnosed at early stage, so stages 1 and 2, compared to other ethnic groups. Whereas the mixed ethnic group show the largest proportion of late stage cancers, so stage 3 and 4, possibly a difference in health seeking behavior between the groups, although a different frequency of cancer types and age sex structure between ethnic groups needs to be taken into account, as well as random variation from small numbers. So in conclusion for ethnicity, the white ethnic group has the highest incidence after adjusting for age. Lung cancer is the most common in the mixed ethnic group, whereas prostate cancer is the most common in the Black ethnic group and female breast cancer in the Asian ethnic group. And there's possible evidence to suggest the percentage of early diagnosis is slightly better for the Asian ethnic group and slightly worse for the mixed ethnic group, but further analysis is required. I will now hand over to Ffion, who will take you through the other characteristics. Thanks, Ffion.
Thanks. Thank you, Becky. So one of the other characteristics we looked at was overcrowding. And we measured that by looking at the ratio of number of people in a household to the number of bedrooms within that household. So looking at the crewed rates here, we can see that they're significantly higher for those who had one spare room and then significantly lower for those who had an ideal number of rooms. So we think this is likely due to differences in age structure. So older people more likely to have that one spare room as kind of children leave and flee the nest. So that theory is supported after we age standardise. On the chart here, we can see that the rates in people with 1 and 2 spare rooms do fall. But the rates in 1 spare room, they're still relatively high, which we thought was interesting, but we're not really sure what could explain that at this point. We're also seeing that the rates are highest in those with fewer rooms than required and lowest in those with 2 or more spare rooms. So we think that's kind of showing a link to deprivation. Then looking at stage by household tenure, we found it quite difficult to really conclude anything from this, mainly because of the differences in the unknowns between each group. So that could be inflating the figures we're seeing across the stages. So really the only thing we could conclude was that there were fewer unknowns in those with the ideal number of rooms compared to the others. So in conclusion for overcrowding, crewed rates are significantly higher with those with 1 spare room, likely reflecting the impact of age, and then age standardised rates are highest for those with fewer rooms than required, and that's likely reflecting the impact of deprivation. Next characteristic that we looked at was occupation. So we've got 2 groups that we looked at here. We looked at the active occupation group. So those are people who were working at the time of the census, or the time they filled out the census. And we looked at what they put on as their current occupation. Then we've got the retired occupation group. So they were the people who had been retired at the time of the census, and we looked at what they classified as their occupation pre-retirement. So generally, the crewed rates for the active group are significantly higher in those jobs requiring lower standards of education. So those highlighted, those are the jobs that are defined as needing lower standards of education, and that's based on the Standard Occupational Classification from 2010. So you can see that actually there's a exception to the general conclusion that we've made in this output, because the admin occupations who sit in the group of requiring a good standard of general education are actually providing us with the second highest rate. We think this could be led by breast cancer. Obviously, breast cancer is far more common in women. It's one of the most common cancers diagnosed in Wales. And then we've got far more women in admin jobs than we do men. But in terms of comparing the 2 groupings in terms of lower standards of education and those requiring better standards of education, we definitely think there's a protective factor for those with the kind of better standard of education, and that's probably linked with deprivation. So then we looked at the retired occupation, and again, we're seeing a similar thing where rates are generally significantly higher in those with jobs requiring lower standards of education. But the exception this time is of the managerial group. So they're showing significantly lower rates than the other jobs within their grouping. Something else that's interesting to note, so when we're comparing the retired occupation to the active, our kind of admin occupation rates are quite different. So we can see that in this chart, they are kind of showing the fifth highest rate, a lot lower than what they were for the active occupation. Again, we're not entirely sure why at this point. Maybe admin roles have changed across generations, but an interesting thing we noticed. In terms of comparing all the other occupation rates across the active and retired group, they were relatively comparable, nothing really stood out. So then we looked at the cancer type by active occupation. So you can see that female breast cancer is far more common than any other of the main cancer types in the occupation groups that are female dominant, so things like your admin, care and leisure, and sales. And then prostate cancer is more common than any other cancer types in the occupation groups that are male dominant, so skilled trade, process plants and managers, as we'd expect, really. Same trend was seen as well with the retired occupation group. And then looking at stage by active occupation, you can see that the process plant and machine operatives had the lowest proportions of diagnosis at an early stage. So early stage is grouping stage 1 and 2 together. And they're closely followed then by our skilled trade and elementary occupations, so suggests some sort of disparity might exist for these groups. Then we've got the admin and secretary occupations showing highest early stage diagnoses. So again, we think this is driven by female breast cancer, as this often tends to be diagnosed in those earlier stages. But professional occupations are also showing a relatively high early stage diagnosis as well, so suggesting more protective characteristics, possibly again linked to deprivation. Yep. So in conclusion, for occupation, generally rates are significantly higher in those jobs requiring those lower standards of education. Our process plant and machine operatives have the lowest proportion of diagnosis at an early stage, and our admin and professional occupations have highest proportions of diagnosis at an early stage. So the final characteristic we looked at in this phase was household tenure. So looking at the accrued rates, we can see that they were highest in those who were socially renting. So we think that's likely due to deprivation, but then that's closely followed by those who owned a house outright, which we think is likely due to age, as people have gotten older and paid off their mortgage. So age standardised supports this theory again about the kind of accrued rates in higher being in those who owned outright, because now they've become the smallest after taking out that confounding factor. The owned outright rates also appear to give an impact of deprivation, because they're showing significantly lower rates than any of the other groupings on there. Then looking at the proportion of each cancer type by household tenure, can see that those who socially rented, lung cancer was more common than any of the main cancer types. This again could be linked to deprivation. We know in general lung cancer tends to be more common those who are from lower deprived backgrounds. We can then see for those who owned a house with a mortgage or loan, female breast cancer was more common than any of the main cancer types. And then for those who owned a house outright, prostate was more common than any other main cancer type. Again, we think this could be linked to kind of your older male population, maybe paid off the mortgage, so they own the house outright, and possibly also with deprivation in that they might be least deprived, because that's the kind of group we tend to see more likely diagnosed with prostate in general. So in conclusion, for household tenure, the rates are significantly higher in those in social rented and owned with mortgage, loan, or shared ownership. And then in terms of the distribution of cancer by household tenure, for those socially renting, lung cancer was more common than other cancer types. And for those who owned a house with mortgage or a loan, female breast cancer was more common than any other cancer types. Just a few caveats to cover. So Becky's already talked about the substituting data for ethnicity using the ethnicity spine, so just something to be aware of. I think the really important bit is being aware of the different timeframes we had to use for each data set. due to data availability. So our cancer diagnosis data covers 2011 to 2020. Our assigned variables based on the 2011 census, and then our denominator counts for rates are based on the 2021 census results. So just something to bear in mind when interpreting the results, and something we're looking to address actually in phase 2. And then 2020 was quite an atypical year for cancer diagnoses due to COVID. So again, something to consider when interpreting the results. And just to note that some of our outputs have been suppressed for privacy disclosure control. So in terms of our next steps, we're looking to move on to phase 2. So for phase 2, we want to bring in Census 2021 to produce our proportions. We're also looking at doing a multivariate analysis. We can consider the effect of confounding factors. And then we're also looking to assess more kind of protected characteristics. So for example, things like LGBTQ+ status. Thank you for listening, and open for any questions. Thanks.